Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and I am an event host for Bank Square Books and Savoy Bookshop and Cafe. We are so delighted that you're able to tune in to today's virtual event, which is the last in our self-improvement series. Today, we are partnering with Mystic Yoga Shala, which I think is such a great way to finish up the series and to just kick off the new year. So this should be a good one. Just a couple of pieces of business before we begin. We definitely want to encourage you to chat in during the event. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat button, and that should pop up a new window where you can chat to either just the panelists or to everybody if you change it to panelists and attendees. So say hello, let us know where you're watching from, and feel free to ask questions. We just ask that you adhere to the virtual code of conduct, which has already been posted in the chat. If you do want to ask questions, you can do it either in the chat or using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So it's just like the chat button. It'll pop up a new window, and you can submit your question that way. And then people can also vote for questions that are most interesting. And we will get to those at the end of the event. If you're joining us today from Facebook Live, thank you so much for tuning in as well. We will do your best to filter your comments in, but to really participate in the conversation, come join us on Zoom. This event is being recorded, so if you have to leave or step away for a minute, you can always revisit it at a later date. And if you'd like to purchase a copy of today's book, The Truth of Yoga by Daniel Simpson, I will be posting a link to this book in the chat as well. So that'll take you over to our website where you can complete your purchase. If you already purchased a copy, thank you so much. And be sure to see if your book is available for pickup at our locations. I left the store earlier today and we did have a bunch in stock, so they are ready to be picked up. So without further ado, I am delighted to introduce Daniel Simpson to discuss his book, The Truth of Yoga. Hi, Daniel.
Hey, Stephanie.
Hi.
Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. So Daniel Simpson teaches at the Oxford Centre for Hindu Studies, in teacher trainings around the UK, and at Triyoga in London. He's a graduate of Cambridge University and has a master's from the University of London, which is great. I love London. I've been a bunch of times and I miss it. I was supposed to go earlier last year and of course didn't.
I miss it too. It's been a while.
Yeah. And then we also today have Dechan from Mystic Yoga Shala with us. And this is an excellent place to practice yoga in our area. I am new to the area, but this is definitely on my list of places to check out. It's been around since 2006 and it has helped many people, many students become teachers. They've eventually run their own studios. So I will also, I'll pop a link in the chat to that website as well. So Daniel's going to speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to audience questions that have been submitted through the Q&A button or through the chat. So Daniel, I'll go ahead and take it away. Feel free to share your screen.
Okay, great. I will. I'll put some slides up. Yeah.
Great.
Hopefully Zoom will behave. Hopefully you're now seeing some pictures. Yeah. Okay,
yes.
good. Great. All right. Well, The Truth of Yoga. It's a bold claim. And if that wasn't enough, it's got a subtitle, A Comprehensive Guide to Yoga's History, Texts, Philosophy, and Practices. It's not a thick book, so you wouldn't, if you pick up a copy, necessarily feel that you had everything that could possibly be said on the subject. But what I hope you would find is an overview. That's been my objective in writing the book, to address those very complex topics. Where does yoga come from? What do all the texts that have talked about yoga over the centuries have to say about what it's about, what it's for, what philosophies therefore have grown up around it, and ultimately, which is the main question that most of us have, what do we do? And how does all of that relate to these ideas? And why should we care about history anyway? So hopefully I'm going to, in a short overview, sum up some of those themes and maybe stir a few questions up in you, and hopefully we can have a good chat at the end. So let's move on, see what we find. Well, the first thing we find is we better define some terms. If you go to a Sanskrit English dictionary, yoga is a word from the ancient Sanskrit language, and obviously now it's become synonymous with something in Western mind. So making shapes on a mat in a room with other people, usually going through a sequence, sometimes these days with a musical soundtrack. none of that in the Sanskrit dictionary, obviously. So what do we find there? Well, this is a word cloud made of all the words that you do find in the most sort of often consulted Sanskrit English dictionary. And the one in the middle jumps out. It sounds a bit like yoga, yoke. And the English word yoke comes from the same linguistic root way back when, several millennia ago. So there's something implied, underneath yoke, you see the word joining, making things fit together somehow. Seems to be a common theme, but if you start to look around those two words, it all gets a bit more complicated. There's about 50 definitions, and they include such things as magic, trick, business, deceit, employment, wealth, many things perhaps associated with the modern yoga marketplace, but also all sorts of things related to going to war. And the original use of the word yoga was to yoke an animal to a chariot for that purpose. So it's a generic term, and therefore it gets used in many, many different ways in different texts, which brings us to the second problem, which truth? Because there's lots of different yogas, not just different uses of that word, but even when we zero in on the application of the word to something a little bit more like what we might be familiar with, it varies enormously. Sometimes you have descriptions of something you see here on this slide, sitting. Perhaps there's moving around a mala, like a rosary of beads, chanting, sometimes associated with yoga, sometimes not at all. Sometimes meditation is the focus, sometimes not really about that. Sometimes about devotion and deities. This is the deity Shiva. All these pictures are subtly different, yet they look quite similar. So any attempt really to pin down the yoga tradition, or the one true yoga, as I've called it here on the slide, quoting from my book, is doomed to failure, unfortunately. There are many, many yogas saying many, many different things that completely contradict each other in different contexts at different times. And therefore, the first truth of yoga that we've got to really take on board is that it's changed, and it's continually been changing throughout its history. And therefore, in some ways, what we've seen in the modern era, the evolution of this practice that I was alluding to, groups in rooms performing sequences of postures, which is relatively recent, maybe 100 years ago is the earliest of those classes, as I'll talk about in a moment. There is a much, much older yoga tradition, and although that shift in the modern era sounds like a radical departure, I'll see why in a moment, it's just continuing a process that's been ongoing throughout the history of yoga. So how old is yoga is really the first question I think we need to address. And the honest answer is we don't know. It's impossible to say. It has been said for best part of 100 years now that yoga is 5,000 years old. And the evidence for this, the entirety of the evidence, in fact, is on the left-hand side of this slide. The depiction of a figure apparently sitting cross-legged. Nothing is said about why, what it's doing, who it might be. Many, many theories have been developed based on lots of other things that have been said about yoga a lot more recently, including that it's what you see on the right, which comes from BKS Iyengar's book, Light on Yoga, which is more like 50 years old. And the suggestion is that they're the same thing. This is the first depiction of somebody adopting a meditative posture, said sometimes to be the depiction of the deity Shiva again, who was on the previous slide. But we just don't know. This is from the earliest civilization in ancient India that we have any record of, the Indus Valley civilization. It didn't leave written records. Its script, which is the sort of squiggly signs you see on the top of that little piece of soapstone, has yet to be deciphered. We have no idea, really. And after that, it's quite a long time until we actually get something describing a practice, or to be more precise, as we'll see in a moment, the outcome of a practice that's called yoga. So 5,000 years, we probably have to throw out the window, at least in terms of something we can prove. Then it's a very open question. If you go forward 2,500 years from there, so about 2,500 years ago from today, you get the earliest textual description of something that's called yoga. And this comes from one of the early Upanishads, which is sort of part of India's most old and sacred collection of texts known as the Vedas. In this Katha Upanishad, it says that yoga is control of the senses. When the control of the senses is fixed, that is yoga. Why? Because then you're free from distraction. And the reason you need to be free from distraction is because all the desires lurking in the heart are removed, and then you just transcend the worlds. A mortal person becomes immortal. There's a lot going on in there, but that same description recurs throughout history, really, until very recently. The aims of yoga were very often described in very similar language. Reining things in, focusing inwards, disengaging from the outside world. And we'll talk about why as we go through. But it looks something like this. It's adopting a seated position, and for most of the history of yoga, that was the only posture described, to internalize awareness and to disengage from the outside world, to avoid being sucked out by the senses into engagement with the world. They're the means by which we're drawn to seek the things we enjoy and try and stay away from the things we dislike. And the practice of yoga evolved as a way of stopping doing that, because it was said that was the cause of suffering. As soon as you get attached to things that you like, you want more of them. And so you go out in the world trying to get them. And this process of, it's known as karma, you might recognize it, drives the endless cycle of births and deaths. The attempt to gratify ourselves pushes us out in the world into activity. We get some things we like, sometimes we get frustrated. Therefore, we get agitated and we get driven into the next sequence of actions. The practice of yoga was an attempt to stop acting, to cut the problem off at source, to never again suffer because you never again act. So sit there like a stone, like a piece of wood, some of the early descriptions, and disappear. That's obviously not what you would get very far selling a workshop on in the 21st century. So we need to look at what's changed since then and why. But one of the early descriptions that sort of tries to broaden things out a bit and summarize lots of things that have come under the umbrella of yoga practice in the first sort of 300 or 400 years of textual descriptions is a text known as the Mahabharata, which is the oldest, the longest this time of India's texts, a vast piece of work, maybe 100,000 verses. And it mentions, because it basically says it covers everything in existence. If it's not in the Mahabharata, it doesn't exist according to Indian tradition. And therefore yoga is in there. And there's a summary of what it means to practice yoga. And it says, really, yoga is meditation. And not only has yoga meant sitting, it's by and large, for most of its history, meant meditation. So meditation is the most effective way of practicing yoga. And those who know the Vedas, the text I was talking about a moment ago, but the Sanskrit word Veda just means knowledge. So the people who know knowledge, the wise ones, they understand there's two ways of going about this. And one of them is difficult. It involves just that disengagement process, focusing the mind, trying to just discern the difference between the pure witness of everything and the parts of the mind that latch on to what the senses feed it and drag it out into further activity. Or there is this other technique, breath control. And throughout the history of yoga, that's been the main physical practice. So other than sitting still and meditating, working with breathing to quieten the mind so that it's less interested in the outside world. That's pretty much what yoga was for most of its history. And evidently, obviously, that's not what it is now. So as I keep alluding to, we'll need to understand why it's become something else. There was also in the background something else that was not necessarily always called yoga, but has influenced the evolution of yoga as we know it today. And again, it's not very appealing. It's known as asceticism generally when described by scholars, the practice of intense austerities, subjecting the body to extremes of discomfort in order again to do something similar, to disengage from the demands of the world. in some ways, this is the purest form of transcending karma, deciding never to do anything again, or never to do anything with your arm again, for example, putting it up in the air, holding it there forever. The guy you see on the right, he had his arm in the air for a large part of his adult life, and he died that way. The guy on the left been standing on one leg for best part of a decade, and often that sort of thing was undertaken for 12-year stretches. So this was postural yoga as first conceived, doing something other than sitting still, but for the same reasons, to transcend material existence. You might be thinking, hang on, what's this got to do with wellness and self-improvement? We'll get to that too. It was a very crude approach, what we're looking at here, really dealing with this problem of the cycle of births, the problem of suffering in the mind that's caused through the senses and the outside world. This was the foundational question for all old Indian religions. The Buddha engaged with the same stuff. He hung out with people like this and said, after a while of trying everything that they were doing, these guys must be crazy. There's got to be a middle way between this extreme of denial of sensory indulgence, and also at the same time going full tilt into the problem of craving and aversion. So yoga starts to evolve from a similar kind of orientation in a way, the realization that this is rather extreme, and as yoga becomes more popular, methods have to be developed to approach a similar objective in a subtler way. And fast forward now to about 500-600 years ago, a well-known medieval text, the Hatha Pradipika, which means light on Hatha. Hatha is it's another Sanskrit word that means force. And what we've just been looking at in some ways is force, subjecting the body to extremes so that you're not bothered about them, so that you're not affected by pain or pleasure, just not interested in that. The mind detaching to somewhere more rarefied. Physical yoga, though, called Hatha, was a mellower approach to the same thing. Its attempt was really to engage with the body, to do things to transform the body, but ultimately, having done all that, to end up in the same state. So even as recently as 500 years ago, the description of the liberated yogi was one who is completely released from all states, free of all thoughts, and therefore looking like he's dead. Having no sensory engagement with the world, no smell, no taste, not interested in form, touch, sound, not interested in himself. That's really the key thing, actually. We'll need to come back to that in more detail, or in others. So this idea in the modern world of yoga, something we do to feel better in our bodies, to perhaps feel better around one another, to perhaps therefore inspire more harmonious social relationships, has not been the concern of yoga for most of its history. There are strands that talk about that, and we'll come back to that as well in a moment. But just to emphasize, it's a bit confrontational, this bit. I just want to ram home. Yoga is not what we think of as yoga for most of its history. And we need to therefore think about how we make sense of what we read in these texts. Because the same text that just talked there about looking like you're dead is one of the first places that teaches something other than sitting. And there's not many postures taught in this text. And of those that it does teach, 15, not that many aren't sitting, or at least floor-based. There's a couple of arm balances, though. And on the top row, second from the left, Mayurasana, the peacock posture. That seems to be the first non-seated pose to have been taught in a text. The thing we should acknowledge, of course, though, is that texts are just writing down some things that are being practiced that we don't really know much more about. There's many things that weren't written down, but we don't have any evidence for them. All we've got is what's been written down. So this arm balance is said to have a particular physical benefit. It wasn't something to do for a start. You couldn't hold it for 40 years. Lucky to hold it for 40 minutes, perhaps even 40 seconds. But it was described as improving digestion. And surprisingly, stick your elbows in your gut, it's going to keep you regular. and therefore also perhaps you could digest poison, it was said. So all of these postures were preliminaries in a way to the seated practices we've seen so far, but making it, you know, a bit more possible to sit for a long time, and also perhaps therefore to be something that you might not do forever, to be a preparation for a little bit of yoga and then returning to the world, something that people who have jobs and families might engage in. So thankfully this shift does start to take place, and it takes place for a particular reason, a reinvention really in Indian spiritual traditions of how we perceive the body, and that comes from philosophies that are broadly known as tantric, and obviously in the modern era that tends to imply funky workshops on sexual techniques. There are some tantric texts that teach certainly sexual rituals, although they're probably not as appealing as what might be on offer these days. For the most part, though, they're talking about the worship of deities through the body. And instead of the body being an obstacle, the body becomes something that can be divinized, as this scholar refers to it, Gavin Flood, who's the academic director of the Oxford Centre of Hindi Studies where I teach. And therefore, the whole point of tantric worship, this is something that's evolved, you know, from about 1500 years ago until about 1000 years ago, is to cultivate the body, not to beat it into submission or to ignore all of its sensory information. It's actually to channel all of that into an understanding of divinity in all things. So whether or not we're interested in the worship of deities through the body, thankfully that leads to physical yoga turning into something a little bit more appealing. And the mechanism through which this happened is something that, you know, again, we might be familiar with, but perhaps because of the modern way these things are described, not very familiar with the original meaning. Chakras, we're talking about here, which are often described in modern contexts as if they're somehow inherent to the body, and maybe need to be unblocked or balanced or harmonized in some way. But in the original tantric context, this was something that was imagined through visualization in meditation. Instead of trying to transcend the body, we were trying to, in those traditions, light it up like a Christmas tree, installing all sorts of things in particular places with particular mantras around this design of the root chakra. There are various seed syllables from the Sanskrit alphabet, and therefore to make the body into, you know, the sort of embodiment of God, effectively. And that enters physical yoga practice as, you know, an influence. It's not that all physical yoga is tantric. It's not even that all yoga is religious, but it's a shift in relationship to the body. And that really leads us very quickly into what we now know as modern yoga, based on doing things with the body to transform it, to feel better in it. And as you know, was advertised here just over 100 years ago outside Mumbai, something that, you know, we can do is a little bit of de-stress from the stresses of modern life. This is the first known, at least first recorded evidence of a public yoga class for middle-class urban people. The man of the world, as it's described here, and the teacher there, Yogendra, was the first, as I say, who's known to have done that. And around the same time, many very inventive, creative teachers of yoga, mixing and matching lots of different influences and drawing on those ancient traditions that we've just talked about, but combining them with new things to make stuff like this, which some of you may be familiar with, the primary series of Ashtanga Vinyasa Yoga, or at least part of it. Sun salutations, of which there's no record in any yoga text really until the 20th century. Standing postures, again, no real historical evidence of this. Unclear where they've come from, but certainly in the early 20th century, lots of new approaches to working with the body, gymnastics in some ways, bodybuilding, as some scholars have talked about it, combined with ancient yogic techniques to find new ways of stretching and moving the body that make it more pleasant to be in. But also, and this is where it's really important, you know, if we want to have a connection with older traditions are also a way of refining awareness. And just because things are new doesn't mean that they're inauthentic. It's possible through the same, sort of engagement with the practice that was there behind everything else we've just looked at, to have a meditative relationship with embodied existence. And this quotation comes from an edition of the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. I haven't mentioned yet, surprisingly, sometimes thought of as the father of yoga, but only one of many people to summarize lots of teachings on yoga. And in the first chapter of his sutras, a collection of 195 pithy statements, there is number 39, which talks about you can meditate on anything you like, basically. And it's suggested here, therefore, that if you're, regardless of your interest in all of the other stuff we've been describing about, what yoga's for, what its truth claims are, as long as you're interested in physical practice, don't even have to be for any particular high motivation, and then you focus your mind on doing it, then it's possible to become absorbed. And absorption really is the aim of yoga. Absorption, whether it's in meditation, in the deity, if you go in for the religious variety, in concentration. And through concentration on this physical practice, these rather creative early 20th century teachers found a way of synthesizing this, leave the world behind, sit still, do difficult things to yourself history, with something a little bit more appealing. However, working with the body is, of course, a way to get lost if we're not careful. For a start, you can tie yourself in a knot you might not get out of, but also we get more attached to it. We get fixated on what it can do and showing it off on Instagram. And that's not the purpose of yoga. So this modern method comes, with a lot of danger in a way. The path of yoga is sometimes likened, sort of all Indian spiritual traditions, really, to walking on the edge of a razor, very sharp with steep sides, very easy to fall off. And working through the body, we can get, as I say, more attached to the body. And that's only going to increase our potential to suffer. And for that, sort of to sink in as a sort of realization about what we're doing, we probably have to rewind and go all the way back to the beginning and think, why was anybody doing all of this stuff in the first place? So that we don't suffer, so that we don't experience the anguish that afflicts human beings as just part of being alive. Yoga amounts to the breaking of the connection with suffering, one of the definitions in a very famous yoga text, the Bhagavad Gita, and then also in the Yoga Sutra, as just alluded to, the text written by Patanjali, says, this is appearing in the middle of the second chapter, but it really ought to be the first sutra. Suffering that hasn't happened yet, we can do something about through changing our relationship with the world in front of us. And that's really where yoga philosophy comes in, and really has to be sort of brought out of the background and into the foreground if we're not going to get misled by this modern postural practice into just playing the same game of thinking we're wonderful and at the same time fearing that we might not be because we can't live forever and we're going to have to let go of everything. Gone too far. These were identified by Patanjali as the sort of sources of mental anguish, known as kleshas, afflictions, and they're all rooted in one, ignorance. And that's really not ignorance as in stupidity or just in having the wrong idea as such. It's misunderstanding. It's the opposite of knowledge, is not knowing that we don't know. The problem is we don't know who we are. And it's not just the body that's the source of problems, it's the mind. The mind is the number one thing. That's where postural yoga can mislead us, because we don't necessarily deal with the problem of the mind. And the mind, has been describing, gets hooked on stuff. The middle two branches of the tree, attachment and aversion, reaching out to grab the things we want, trying to stay away from the stuff we don't like, all to feed this idea of ourselves and what we need. So there to the left branch, the ego, which really doesn't mean, sort of the Freudian ego. It comes from a Sanskrit verb. Asmi is the present tense as a verb to be, first person, I am. So it's I amness, the voice in the head that says, this is me, this is my life, this is what I like and don't like, this is how I feel about myself, this is why I think I'm great, this is why I don't like that person because they don't think that I'm great. And ultimately, on the right-hand side of the tree, the big problem. This body, the mind that sort of animates it in some ways, is not going to live forever. So the ultimate craving is to stay alive, the endless quest to be immortal still going on in modern Silicon Valley. And at the same time, the aversion to dying. And the problem is, if we're attached to me as this body and this mind, there's something to lose. And the whole history of yoga philosophy is trying to awaken us to a different way of perceiving ourselves, to realize that we're not the contents of the mind or the physical shell we inhabit. And my book really has summarized a long list of ways in which that's been described over the centuries. Don't have time to go into them all now, but that's really the history of yoga and yoga philosophy. And it gets left behind if we're not careful. So just quickly going to look at one or two ways that it can be resurrected, perhaps brought back into the mix. Instead of striving to be happy, the Yoga Sutra says the best kind of happiness is the one that comes from giving up attempts to make ourselves happy. It's called contentment, santosha. It's advertised as one of Patanjali's niyamas, things that we can do to be a little bit less troubled in our mind, so it's easier to detach. He's still from that old school, radical, leave the world behind approach to yoga. But there's a seed there of something that's very, vital for day-to-day life. He says it's better, 16 times better than the best sex, to destroy desire. To no longer need to rearrange the world in a particular way to make ourselves satisfied with it. Instead, to be okay with reality as it is, not as we would like it to be. The same message that the Buddha had, same message that most Indian sages have had over the centuries, again and again and again. And just in case we think that doesn't sound very worldly, the essence of it is stuck above the entrance to the centre court at Wimbledon via Rudyard Kipling's reinterpretation in his poem If you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat those two impostors just the same, you'll have no problem. And the Bhagavad Gita is all about how to do that. That's really the only yoga text that consistently talks about action, living in the world. That it's possible somehow to interpret, reframe, repackage a lot of these teachings about transcendence, provided we're able to be in the world without activating this problem of desire, this need to make the world the way we'd like it to be. Challenging message, because there's many things in the world that are not acceptable. And therefore, the real skill in action is to not get triggered by everything and yet still be able to do what needs to be done. And that's really the message coming out of the Bhagavad Gita, still very relevant, still being used in those sorts of un-yogic contexts. But to go back to the Gita itself, it's very clear. One who's able to endure here in this very world before liberation from the body, including when it falls to pieces, the agitation that arises from desire and anger is absorbed in yoga. So yoga is to not be concerned by anything. That's a happy person, one who's okay with the world as it is. And it's very hard to do that. And at the same time, there are techniques, and learning to be less attached to our bodies is really the aim of physical yoga practice. But it's very, as I say, easy to go in the opposite direction. So just to sum things up and bring it back to my book, throughout the history of yoga, things have been reinvented. I've got sort of 4 chapters in here going through phases of yoga history. Things get rearranged, old things get chucked away, new spins get put on old ideas. Clearly, there's not a continuity. But if we're now in the modern era going to reach into the past and say, I'm inspired by old ideas from yoga texts, we need to be careful. We need to be clear to distinguish between how we're reframing these messages and what the texts themselves say. And therefore, it helps to know what the texts themselves say, which is again why I wrote my book, to try and summarize what's in the main yoga texts on their own terms, while also pointing to the fact that they don't really speak to us in the language that we want to hear. So we might need to do some reframing. We also need to be careful, because a lot of stuff goes on these days that reframes stuff that doesn't seem to have anything to do with the history of yoga, and calls it yoga. Drunk yoga, rage yoga on the left, saying instead of doing the namaste hands together finger gesture, we stick the middle finger up, chanting fine, maybe feels great, but not sure that it's necessarily transcendence of anger. It's more expression of it, acting it out. Not really to cast judgment, wag my finger, or be the yoga police, more to invite us to think for ourselves, what's yoga? Because in the end, all that really matters is our own relationship with reality. The history of yoga, our experience of the moment, same. It's, are we using what's going on in front of us to get more entangled in suffering, or to try and untangle ourselves? So if any of this stuff is helpful for diminishing suffering, wonderful. I know from my own experience that getting drunk tends to get me more caught up in maudlin self-pity. But moving on, finally, the message really that I've put together in my book is, we don't therefore have to feel like, we've got to go back into the past and ally ourselves with one tradition of yoga, or one text, or try, to be a very good student and live according to what Patanjali had to say 1500 years, 1600 years ago about, the previous 1,000 years of yoga history. We can ignore all the stuff that doesn't make sense to us, as most people do when they read chapter 3 of the Yoga Sutra about magic powers. But again, moving on, all we have to do is be clear about the difference between what the texts themselves say and how we want to make use of them in the 21st century. And so that's what my book's for. And I look forward to answering a few questions about what I've said. But before I move to that, 2 other things. If you do buy the book, you do read it, and you do like it, please think about reviewing it. It's always very helpful to have some reviews. And if you do have any questions, you can find me via my website. So I'll put that link in the chat, but I'm always happy to answer questions. For now, though, I'll stop sharing my screen and see what people have got that they'd like to talk about.
Excellent. Thank you, Daniel. That was wonderful. So much history. Yeah, I found that really interesting. So one question came in while we were talking, it came in through social media. This person said, so yoga has evolved in so many ways and has grown in popularity and accessibility. Is that a good thing? And do you feel anything valuable has been lost in that transition?
An excellent question. I think really it's one that we all have to answer for ourselves. I mean, as I've alluded to, there are many things about the modern yoga world that make it less and less connected to the history of yoga. However, we can also see there's many good reasons to not have too much to do with some of those very extreme original approaches to yoga. Yeah. And I think therefore we have to ask ourselves this question of what's useful, which means we first have to decide what our priorities are. And throughout the history of yoga, there's really been a consistent priority of diminishing suffering, but ultimately absolute escape from suffering. So I think things that have made yoga popular have tended to airbrush that out of the picture because it's quite an ambitious objective. Toning your bum and having a nice six-pack is a much more achievable aim. So it's easier to market that and get people to give you money for it.
Yeah, I noticed too. I think one of the things that I noticed last year, I think the Prince of Wales actually started, instead of shaking hands, it was at the beginning of the pandemic, instead of, he still had some events to attend, instead of shaking hands, he was saying namaste to people. And I just think that it was kind of funny. I know a lot of people kind of laughed at it, but I know a lot of people actually really loved that as kind of a new greeting in this new world that we're living in with the pandemic and everything going on. I was just curious, like if things like that are kind of more, I don't know if you would consider it like a pop culture trend, but something like that. Do you feel like that is an appropriate thing, or do you feel like that is maybe taking away from what yoga should be?
Well, I think we should acknowledge first of all, these are again just 2 Sanskrit words, namas and te. Basically originally Namah, which is the end of the mantras like Om Namah Shivaya. But it means I bow down. So I bow down to you. And it's used in India as a greeting. You just say, I mean, it's quite a formal greeting. People might more often say Namaskar. You get the word Surya Namaskar, you know, bowing down to the sun, same thing. So it's basically just, it's greetings really. So it's a respectful salutation. So there's no real harm in that, I think. What people get, I think, understandably upset about is, you know, the way that these things immediately get turned into marketing slogans and, you know, namaste in bed all day or whatever, sort of some cheesy phrase, making a pun on a word. I'm going to take something that I don't really understand, I'm going to spin it into a new, you know, commercially viable form and make money off it. And I do understand why that annoys people, but
maybe it cheapens things.
Well, yeah, it's just not very respectful. It's this isn't an especially profound word either. Namaste. It's like turning hello into some t-shirt slogan. Yeah. It's a bit weird.
Although I love the new slogan, Namaste 6 feet away.
Now that's good. That's creative. Great. I like it. That's exactly in the spirit of what Stephanie was suggesting. I'm down with that.
Yeah.
Very appropriate these days.
That's great. So we do have a question that just came in from Steve. Steve would like to know what might be the most significant insights into daily practice that Daniel's scholarship has given him.
Well, I should first of all probably acknowledge that, you know, I'm not the sort of real yoga scholar here. There are lots of people in the last 25 years who've been doing amazing, groundbreaking research. I've had the good fortune to study with several of them, and it's really the benefits of you know, being exposed to their work that I'm sharing in a more sort of accessible format. A lot of what they write is quite dense and academic and less easy to engage with. And I think, you know, really it's just to remind myself in a way that there are themes and that they do recur. Because the scholarly world sometimes gets hung up on all of these distinctions and the fact that yoga has not been the same thing at different times, and that all the different schools of yoga disagree with each other, and various disciplines of Indian philosophy debate each other quite, you know, vehemently and try and prove each other wrong. There are some very, you know, consistent recurring themes, and a lot of them are quite simple. And I think the one that really stands out to me is the centrality of the breath and the therefore, you know, transformative power of breath control practices, pranayama, far less often taught in the modern yoga world. And yet, for most of the history of yoga, as we saw in that early definition, that's sort of, you know, one of the 2 ways to practice yoga meditation. And all of the medieval physical yoga texts talking about the power of the breath to make all sorts of funky things happen inside you, awakening of Kundalini and all sorts of other things. Yeah, just from the point of view of being a bit calmer in the face of, you know, the chaos that modern life is throwing at us, even just, you know, a bit of rhythmic breathing, you know, trying to breathe in for 6 and out for 6, keeping that going for a minute is going to do you a lot of good. And to be reminded, therefore, of, you know, that's, I guess, yeah, more important than whether or not I stick my leg behind my head. It's been refreshing.
Right. Come back to the basics.
Yeah.
I have a question, Daniel. Did you find in your research, did you come across any literature or any examples of people being harmed from pranayama? Through my studies over the years, I do a little bit of you know, breath work, and of course in our asana classes we do teach students to breathe in a calm, rhythmical way, which we find is highly beneficial. But I've heard this kind of rumor in the yoga world that you know, certain forms of breath work called pranayama, you know, should not be taught, or that it could make you go crazy or something like that. And I'm wondering if you came across any.
Well, you can. Sorry, go ahead. Yeah. Well, studies, I don't know. I haven't come across anything that sort of, you know, scientifically analysed this question. And at the same time, breath is powerful, and you can get high. You can get high on your own supply, or you know, you can put yourself into some fairly altered states as well. There's a guy, what's his name, Stanislav Grof, I think, who use intense, fast, deep breathing to simulate the effects of LSD, and it's therefore possible to really trip yourself out. So these things are real, yes, and therefore one has to be cautious and to reach for the Hatha Pradipika, the medieval text I was quoting when I was speaking. It says there at the very beginning, before it starts teaching exactly what to do, just as a lion, elephant, or tiger is tamed step by step, so the breath is controlled. Otherwise, it kills the practitioner. So, even 500-600 years ago, it was unequivocally stated you need to be careful. And there were other texts that say, don't practice this stuff, it's dangerous. You can still still your mind without using the breath in this way, because originally breath control was literally inhale, hold your breath for as long as humanly possible. The Buddha gave a go at it and called it the non-breathing meditation, and so that's obviously quite extreme. So holding the breath for long periods, I think, is the thing that's particularly challenging, or doing a lot of deep breathing again and again and again. And I mean, that's been popularized, I guess, particularly through Kundalini yoga in the West. Also the technique of Kapalabhati, which was originally one of the cleansing techniques taught in Hatha Pradipika, but becomes these days associated with pranayama, particularly in India. Best not to overdo it, I think, with any of those things. And BKS Iyengar, who's one of the few people who's sort of written a sort of encyclopedic text about pranayama practice, he seems quite wary about it. And in the Iyengar system, they teach pranayama, but with such caution, almost going to the opposite extreme. If you go to a 2-hour pranayama class, you probably spend like 90 minutes doing restorative yoga until you get ready to do a few breath rhythms. And I think it's possible to go a little bit. I mean, sometimes I used to do that approach, and sometimes I'd fall asleep because get very comfortable on your bolster. So I think there's a middle ground. You just need to be careful, and that's really the message of these Hatha yoga texts. Although Hatha means force, it's taught in a way that says you should go about these things just as I was describing there, gradually, carefully, slowly, and that's really why this word Hatha, as it now gets used in modern context, has become associated with a gentle approach to yoga. Really, it's powerful, but if you're careful with it, then it doesn't need to damage your mind or your body.
Thank you.
That's interesting.
Okay.
I know. So my background is in counseling, and before I was a bookseller, I was a counselor. And one of the things that we did teach clients a lot of times, and anybody that was coming into counseling, was breathing techniques, because there is such a connection between breath and relaxation, or just mindfulness and awareness, and that I know a lot of times they even one time I went to a chiropractor, and I was having back problems, and one of the things he focused on was breathing. He's like, we've forgotten as a society how to breathe. Absolutely. And it was so odd because, I was a counselor at the time, but I was also seeing this chiropractor, and it was kind of like hearing the stuff that I was telling the people coming to me for counseling from another practitioner. And it was like, oh, this is a good reminder. I need this too. But it makes such a difference.
I think you've really hit the nail on the head there. There's this, firstly, you don't really know how to breathe, but also we're lost in the mind all day long. So, if you sort of think of seeing these pictures of seated yogis, it's like a pyramid shape. There's the head at the top and this big broad base, but we act as if we're the other way up. This bit at the top is taking up all the space, lost in it, and therefore not focusing on the breath because not even aware it's happening. And also not really focused on the body. I know myself, hunched over the keyboard all day long. So I often feel like I do a bit of yoga practice to undo. That is, yoga's undoing. That's one of the other consistent themes. All this layering of stuff that we confound ourselves with, we need to somehow unwind, and then it's ultimately therefore not about doing anything. It's about trying to let go, but being judicious in the sort of use of some effort to then let go a bit. And I think through breath, that's one way to do it very, very obviously. If you pay attention to breath that you've not been observing, it's shallow and it's up in the chest, and it's linked to a jittery mind. So to come back to Dechan's question, there's a recent book by a guy called James Nestor, Nestor, entitled, I think, just Breath. That's really engaging. He talks a lot about different breathing techniques. He had breathing problems. He's a journalist, I think, but yeah, a good popular writer. However, I would caution everything he says about the history of yoga is not very accurate. But the stuff he says about other approaches to breathing, he talks about Stan Grof. He talks about, you might have come across a guy called Wim Hof, a Dutchman, the Iceman, who just by a bit of deep breathing gets people sitting on glaciers. So yeah, it's an interesting world. There's all manner of magic powers to be accessed through the breath.
I think that everyone around the world can benefit from some form of yoga, some style of yoga, whether it be meditation or just becoming more conscious of the breath, to help alleviate anxiety and stress. And especially now too, so many people, have an aversion towards wearing the mask and feel like they can't breathe with the mask, but really the mask to me is simply showing us when we're already not breathing properly or being uncomfortable about our breath.
Absolutely. Yeah. Practice breathing through one nostril all the time. You'll soon get better at breathing through a bit of cloth, definitely.
And I feel like the mask can, help bring you back to how, important it is to breathe consciously. And, you can learn how to relax and drop so much of the anxiety that can be created from wearing a mask, or just the thinking that we have, all of our crazy neurotic thinking.
Absolutely.
That is such an interesting point. So somebody else has just chatted in a question. They said, "Hi Daniel, when you talk about chakras, you said that you said that originally you imagined this supposedly energy centers. Then the question about whether or not they are real or not is quite interesting. What is your personal opinion about it? Do chakras exist? Are each one of us created in them?" I might be reading this incorrectly. But does that make sense?
It does, yeah. If you stick my name and "Are Chakras Real" into Google, you'll find my full opinion, which basically is an extract from the book, the chapter in here. And I've titled it "Imaginary Chakras." And it's provocative because I think the truth is subtler than that. The fact is, originally they were to be visualized. The texts that described them initially in tantric traditions are very clear. They're templates for what has to be placed in a particular location in the body. And there are other descriptions that don't talk about chakras, that talk about meditating on these locations. So they're really ways of refining awareness to get subtler until you just sort of dissolve your mind. But focus your attention on a place, particularly with an idea of awakening something there, and it will start to happen. So the distinction between the mind and the body is what collapses, I think, and therefore the question of whether they really exist or not also collapses. The distinction that something is real if it's physical and not real if it's mental can't really apply if the mind and the body are part of the same continuum. So through this visualization practice, something is transformed within the body and experience is had of something. So the distinction I'm really trying to make is that, in a way, yes, we are all individually creating that. It depends what you put in, which sort of recipe you're following as to what comes out the oven. Whereas the way it's presented in the modern world, especially with the attempts to make it all align with things that are biomechanically identifiable, glands and nerve centers and various other things that you can find. If you cut open a corpse, you'll not find a chakra. So it's a different order of thing. It's a subtler experience of being embodied. And I think the problem is that chakras themselves have become the shorthand for that whole subtle experience of being embodied. And yoga practices talking about that in many different ways. That's just one manifestation of it.
Interesting. Well, go ahead.
Sure. Thank you. Have you heard of the idea that the chakras are maybe associated with the endocrine system?
That's definitely a theory, yeah. But I mean, obviously, there's a reason that there was a focus on these places. However, there's so many texts talking about focusing on the same places without really talking about the existence of these spinning wheels. Chakra, again, is a Sanskrit word, it just means a wheel. So the idea of these spinning energy discs, and they only become that through imagining that's what's there. In other texts, it just says, that's the place of the deity so-and-so, or this is the site of your meditation. It just says focus on your genitals, basically, rather than a particular thing that's there. So I think that's an attempt, again, a bit like there's a modern inclination to look to the yoga tradition and try to validate things by showing connections to antiquity. And this is part of the problem. I mean, modern postural yoga has absolutely nothing to do with Patanjali's Yoga Sutra in terms of physical practice. The only physical practice there is sit still, shut up. It's not anything else.
Pretty simple.
But the problem is that obviously teachers want to make it sound like, they've got this ancient authenticity to what they're doing. So they come up with all these stories, and that confuses us. But things don't need to be old to be useful. And similarly, we don't need the validation of science to make it a worthwhile endeavor to engage in a visualization practice. It has its own merits. It doesn't need to conform to that. And I think the original impulse to do this sort of thing came from India. There was an attempt to show that yoga was very modern and should be adopted by the masses. This is really how modern yoga evolved. Something that was kind of marginal and certainly not really to be engaged in by polite society, associated particularly with tantrics and weird deviants, but somehow became this thing, that was part of the Indian independence movement, using the body to improve the stock of the nation effectively. So there was an attempt to show, at this time, obviously India is under colonial occupation. So you got a bunch of arrogant Westerners thinking they know everything. So Indians are trying to say, well, no, hang on a minute, we've got ancient wisdom here that's equal to your scientific knowledge. So I think a lot of the attempts to prove the effects of yoga scientifically were part of that project. I just don't think we need to worry so much about that. It's very hard because yoga is something, if it's science, it's a scientific experiment we're doing on ourselves individually, and we can't inhabit each other's consciousness. We can have ideas about transcendent awareness, but that still doesn't mean I know what it's like to be in someone else's body. So there isn't really a way, therefore, of having randomized controlled trials or any of the other, panoply of methods that modern science uses to prove things. So it's very hard to replicate anything other than to say, try this, see if it helps. And different techniques help some people and not others. And some people have got bodies that can do some things and not others. And it's good to remember, as you emphasized there, Dechin, which is really important. Yoga is, it's accessible to anybody. You don't have to do anything particular. It's about paying attention. And pay attention, then great. All sorts of magic things happen when we pay attention.
Dechin, before we wrap up, would you mind just telling everybody a little bit about Mystic Yoga Shala and where they can find you guys?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you so much. We are located in Mystic, Connecticut, across from the Big Y, but we're also streaming our classes live on Zoom. And we have students actually from all over the world that have been coming to class, and then local, people are welcome to come into the studio. We teach a particular methodology. We teach the Baptiste methodology. So this is a particular style of asana practice. We also offer yin yoga as well. And we have a wonderful community. And it changed my life. I'll just say, I love saying this. I was fired from a corporate job years ago in the 80s because I punched someone. I'm a very rajasic, fiery person, and had a lot of anger in me.
So the rage yoga might be perfect.
And a friend, a friend of mine, an eccentric friend of mine, said, it's time for you to, to come go to a yoga class. And at that time, I thought it was a cult. That was the only thing I'd heard about yoga. I thought it was a cult of some sort. I really didn't know what to expect. But after my first class, which was at a Shivananda ashram in Manhattan, actually, after that first class, from the asanas and the meditation and the chanting that we did and the pranayama, I I knew after that first class that it was something that I needed. And I felt it was the first time in my life where I felt grounded, sober, and high at the same time. And I knew it in that moment. I said, this is for me. This is something that I'm going to have to incorporate for the rest of my life. And I will say, as Daniel mentioned, it has helped to alleviate my, suffering in all of its forms. And I love sharing and teaching it to others, and so that's what we do at the Shala. We're going to teach you asana. We also do meditation there as well. And we have a wonderful community. Beginners are welcome. And we feel that our studio is for everyone. There's ways to modify the postures. And also to my teachers that I'm so grateful for, always taught me that asana should be a way to keep your body healthy and strong and to lead you into meditation. It should be a way that, keeps you healthy and that eventually leads you into the practice of meditation. And I do find that it is very helpful as like a preparation for meditation. Of course, you don't have to do any asana at all. You can get right into meditation. But I also love teaching meditation. I'm a heartfulness meditation trainer, and that's a particular meditation that I've been doing since 1999 that I love and has helped me out tremendously. So I love sharing that with others as well. So yogashala.com.
Yep. I just put the link in the chat for anyone interested.
I'll stick my contact address in there as well.
Yeah, that would be great. And then one more time, I will also pop the link in for Daniel's book. I'll put that in the chat as well.
Which is, by the way, I'm almost finished reading it. It's awesome. It really is. Thank you, Daniel. Yeah. And I think anyone who's interested in yoga, a student of yoga, teachers of yoga, definitely grab a copy and read it.
Yes. Well, thank you both so much for joining us today. Daniel, I know it's kind of late over there, so thank you for giving up your evening and talking to us today. And everyone be sure to check out the book and check out Mystic Yoga Shala, and enjoy your afternoon. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all for coming.
Nice to meet you.